On the 5th of January 1942, the streets of Tokyo were filled with happy shouts of victory. But as the people celebrated, Admiral Yamamoto was already thinking about the next fight. He told the staff of the Imperial Combined Fleet to start planning for the second stage of the war in the Pacific Ocean. He looked at the reports from the Philippines, from Malaya, and from other places to the south. These reports showed that Japanese soldiers would soon control all of East Asia and the other lands they had attacked in December. This was happening very fast. Yamamoto told his chief of staff, Matong Ugaki, that he wanted these new plans to be finished by the middle of February. The great speed of the Japanese armies as they conquered the Western Pacific was a surprise to everyone. It even surprised the planners in Tokyo. This quick success brought on a big disagreement inside the Imperial General Staff. Some of the military leaders were very eager. They were strong nationalists who wanted to keep pushing forward. They believed that as long as Japan was winning, they should keep attacking, no matter how far their armies had to go. But there was another group of men. This group was led by Admiral Yamamoto himself. These men, including Yamamoto, had been less than happy about starting a war with the United States and Great Britain. They were worried about the future. One reason Yamamoto was not in Tokyo, but was at sea on his great flagship, the Yamato, was because of this. His friends on the Imperial General Staff were worried about him. They feared that if he stayed in Tokyo, he would be killed by assassins. This was because he had spoken out in public against a war that had no limits. Even now, out at sea, his thoughts were not a secret to the men around him. His own chief of staff, Admiral Ugaki, wrote down his worries in his private diary. He wrote about the need for far-sighted statesmanship, even after this first month of glorious victory. These were words that Yamamoto himself often used. He was always warning that Japan could not fight a long war against the Western powers and hope to win in the end. This was a very dangerous thing to say when so many others were shouting for more war and more victories. Admiral Yamamoto's sharp criticism was aimed at the politicians in Tokyo. He was not happy with men like Prince Kanoi. He felt that these leaders did not truly understand what sort of war Japan should be fighting in the vast Pacific. He believed they had started a fight without knowing how to finish it. 3 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had a meeting with an old friend. This friend's name was Ryoichi Sasakawa. He was the president of a very nationalist group. They met at the Imperial Navy Club in Shiba. Yamamoto gave his friend a dark warning. He told him that war could not be avoided. The politicians had already made the decisions that made war certain. Yamamoto told him what would happen next. He said that at first, Japan would have everything its own way. It would be like a giant octopus, stretching out its long tentacles in every direction. And now, just 1 month after the war had started, this picture had come true. The octopus was spread almost flat, its tentacles reaching across the ocean. But this was not the end of Yamamoto's warning. He had also told his old friend that this happy feeling, this euphoria, could not last. He said the time for political action, the time to talk about peace, would be the very moment that Singapore fell. He believed that such a great disaster would badly unsettle the British in India. He thought they would surely be willing to listen to talk of peace. Yamamoto knew the British people well. He had been part of the delegations to the big London naval conferences in 1930 and 1934. He also knew the Americans. He had served as the Japanese naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. He agreed that once the politicians started the war, a major victory must be won very quickly. But when that victory was won, he believed Japan would have only a year and a half to enjoy its glory. He told his friend Sasakawa that they must get a peace agreement by then. He hoped his old friend would carry this warning to the right-wing political leaders who are now in power. On that day, January 5th, the victory seemed very close indeed. The American battleship fleet, their great pride, had been put out of action at Pearl Harbor on December 7th. It was a terrible blow to the Americans. The British had also suffered. Their powerful battleships, the Repulse and the Prince of Wales, had been sunk off the coast of Malaya. In the Philippines, the capital city of Manila and the big United States naval base at Cavite had both been captured by Japanese forces. The British had been forced to surrender at Hong Kong, a jewel of their empire. And everywhere, Japanese soldiers were on the move, landing in the Dutch East Indies, at Rabaul, on New Ireland, at Amboyna, and even in the Solomon Islands. It seemed like nothing could stop the rising sun. For the people back home in Japan, it was a time of great joy. They believed their warriors were invincible, and that the war would be over soon. The map of Asia was changing color every day, and it was all turning Japanese. But the attack at Pearl Harbor, as successful as it was, had not done everything Admiral Yamamoto had hoped for. There was one very big problem. The most important ships in the American fleet, the aircraft carriers, had not been destroyed. They had been out at sea on that day and were completely unharmed. These carriers were a constant threat. They were like a dagger pointed at Japan. Yamamoto knew that as long as those carriers were sailing, the Americans could still fight back. What Japan needed now was another spectacular achievement, a victory so big it would crush the American spirit. Yamamoto did not expect the great British base of Singapore to fall for another 5 or 6 months. He was wrong about that. It fell much sooner, on February 15th, but even that was not enough. He believed that if he was going to set the stage for peace negotiations, he had to move his fleets in a different direction. The question that his planners had to answer was simple: where to strike next? The planners got to work, and the first idea brought up was an attack on the Soviet Union. Yamamoto's planners suggested it, but the army immediately said no. The army leaders vetoed the suggestion. They argued that such a war would be fought almost entirely on land, and the army was already very busy. It had huge numbers of men fighting in China, a war that had been going on for years. It was also heavily occupied with the new conquests in Southeast Asia. There were simply not enough soldiers to open a new massive front against the Russians. So that plan was thrown away. With the Soviet Union off the table, 3 other ideas were offered. Yamamoto had his own favorite. He wanted to attack in the Indian Ocean. His plan was to invade Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. He believed this would draw out the British Far Eastern Fleet, and he could destroy it, just as he had destroyed the American ships at Pearl Harbor. This plan was about more than just ships. After destroying the British fleet, Yamamoto wanted to push his forces into the Middle East. His grand idea was to link up with the German armies. At that very time, the Germans were driving hard toward the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. If the Japanese Navy could join them, they would be assured of all the oil they could ever need. Oil was the lifeblood of the war machine, and Japan had very little of it. Securing this oil would mean Japan could fight forever. It was a bold and massive plan. But once again, the army refused to consider it. A Middle Eastern operation was just too big and too far away for them. They would not support it. So Yamamoto's favorite plan was also rejected. This left only 2 plans on the table for the admirals to argue about. The great disagreement about where to strike next was only just beginning. One of the 2 remaining plans came from the Naval General Staff in Tokyo. They had a very different idea from Yamamoto. They wanted to attack south to move against Australia. Their main goal was not to conquer the whole giant continent, which would be too hard. Instead, they wanted to cut it off completely from its allies. They wanted to deprive the Americans of that big forward base of operations. The Americans were already sending thousands of men and shiploads of supplies to Australia. They were using it as a great staging ground to prepare to fight back against Japan. The Tokyo staff's plan was to first move strongly into the Solomon Islands. After that, the Navy would capture New Guinea. Then they would push farther south to take New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. These islands formed a long chain, a great barrier across the wide Pacific Ocean. If Japan held all these islands, they could stop the Americans from ever helping Australia. The men who liked this plan at Imperial General Headquarters were very serious. They were already busy setting up occupation systems. They were drawing up papers and plans for how to govern Australia and New Zealand once they were taken. It was a very big, ambitious plan to control the entire South Pacific. But Admiral Yamamoto did not like this Australia plan. He thought it was a bad idea for several reasons. His main problem was that he thought it would take far too long to complete. Capturing all those islands, one by one, would be a slow and grinding job. It would use up too many ships and too many men. And even if it worked, he did not think it would be spectacular enough. It would not be the one single, crushing blow that he was looking for. It would not be the kind of victory that would halt the Americans in their tracks and make them want to talk about peace. Yamamoto also knew something else. He knew that the attack on Pearl Harbor had not scared the Americans. Instead, it had made them furious. It had aroused a powerful spirit of vengeance in the American people. These were the same people the Japanese military had been learning to detest. They called them soft and incompetent. The army said the Americans were too soft to fight a war to the finish. But Yamamoto knew better. He knew they would fight, and fight hard. It was clear that even capturing a great prize like Singapore would not be enough to stop the Americans. Yamamoto wanted a different kind of victory. He wanted a victory so great that it would make it possible for Japan to extend a generous olive branch to offer peace from a position of strength. So in January, Admiral Yamamoto ordered his own planners to draw up another, different plan. He had his own idea, the one he believed would finally end the war. 2 months later, he sent his officers to Tokyo to present this new plan. The document was given a code name, the Me Plan. This plan imagined a massive naval battle off a tiny place called Midway Island. This small island was a key to American defenses in the Central Pacific. Yamamoto's goal was to draw out the American carrier force, the same carriers that had escaped Pearl Harbor. He wanted to force them into a final decisive battle where his own powerful fleet could destroy them completely. With their carriers gone, America's ability to fight in the Pacific would be crippled. He also sent another plan to Tokyo at the same time. This was called the AO Plan. This second plan detailed an invasion of the North American continent, starting with an attack on Alaska and the Aleutian Islands. If all went well, if Midway was a great victory, he believed Hawaii could be occupied next. And after that, perhaps his armies could even land on the west coast of America. At the very least, great victories at Midway and in the Aleutians would give the politicians in Tokyo a very strong base for negotiating the sort of peace that Yamamoto hoped to achieve. Back in Tokyo, the admirals quarreled. They argued loudly around the big conference table in the Navy Ministry. The Naval General Staff still wanted their Australia plan. Yamamoto's men argued hard for his Midway plan. It was a bitter disagreement. But in the end, Admiral Yamamoto had his way. He was the commander of the combined fleet, and his voice was the most powerful. His plan for a decisive battle at Midway was approved. During these arguments, something else was forgotten. The potential significance of the fall of Singapore in February was overlooked. The coming collapse of the American and Filipino forces on Bataan and Corregidor was also ignored. Either of these great victories might have been used for Yamamoto's purpose, to start peace talks. But there was a reason they were no longer seen as important. That reason lay in a shocking event that happened in April. This was the raid by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 bomber squadron. They flew their army bombers off an aircraft carrier and bombed Tokyo itself. The Doolittle raid did very little real damage, but it shocked the Japanese people and their leaders to the core. It was a terrible embarrassment. It proved that the Americans were only beginning to fight. This raid ended all argument. Suddenly, Yamamoto's plan to destroy the American carriers at Midway seemed more urgent than ever. In June, the Great Midway operation flamed into a terrible disaster for Japan. 4 of their biggest and best fleet carriers were sunk, taking with them hundreds of their most skilled pilots. It was a blow from which the Japanese Navy would never truly recover. But back in Japan, there was no time for pointing fingers or blaming the admirals. In fact, most people, and even most of the army, did not even know the full extent of the defeat. The terrible news about the destruction of the 4 carriers was carefully suppressed. It was kept a deep secret, known only at the very highest levels of the Navy. So while the public still believed in glorious victories, the leaders in Tokyo were now hiding a secret that could change the whole war. They had been shocked by Doolittle, rushed into a battle to destroy the American carriers, and had instead been dealt a crippling blow themselves. This secret would hang over all their future plans, a dark shadow they could not speak about. While Admiral Yamamoto had been off on his Midway excursion, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo had not been idle. These were the men who had wanted to attack Australia all along. They had not forgotten their plan. With Yamamoto and the main fleet busy in the Central Pacific, these admirals in Tokyo had moved the Navy and its air forces steadily southward. They were determined to set up the forthcoming attempt to cut off Australia. This was their own big operation, and they pushed it forward. Their forces had already taken the key port of Rabaul on New Britain back in January. From that time onward, they had been very busy. They conducted constant air reconnaissance flights over the whole area. Their bombers and fighters launched raids against the other islands and against the vast, wild land of New Guinea. It was a slow, steady, and dangerous advance, pushing south, step by step, to build a great wall between America and her ally. It was very apparent to the Australians what was happening. They were watching this Japanese move with growing terror. They communicated their deep concerns to General Douglas MacArthur after his arrival in their country in March. MacArthur had escaped from the Philippines, and he now saw the Japanese preparing to do the same thing to Australia. The Australians and MacArthur were sure that the Japanese would soon move against Port Moresby in New Guinea. If they were successful, if they captured that key port, it would be very nearly a walkover for the Japanese to then invade the northern part of Australia. The Japanese had already shown their power. In February, their planes had bombed the Australian city of Darwin, a heavy and shocking raid. Then, in March, they invaded Salamoa on the coast of New Guinea. The pace of the war in the south was stepping up. The Japanese were getting closer and closer, and the Australians felt they were next. In May, just before the great battle at Midway, the Japanese sent a big occupation force by sea, heading toward Port Moresby. But this time, they were turned back. They were stopped by the fierce defense of the Americans and Australians in the first great carrier battle of the war, the Battle of the Coral Sea. It was a hard fight, and both sides took losses, but the invasion of Port Moresby by sea was stopped. This victory, however, did not stop the Japanese completely. They did manage to occupy Tulagi, a small island just north of a larger, jungle-covered island called Guadalcanal. There, on Tulagi, they began to build a seaplane base. The Battle of the Coral Sea, even though it was a kind of victory, only convinced the planners in Washington and in Australia that they had to prepare for the next big Japanese move in the south. The Japanese had been stopped, but everyone knew they would try again. General MacArthur told the Australian government that it must be ready for an attack. He warned them that this attack might come even before a Japanese thrust toward India, which many people expected. He cabled General Marshall in Washington, telling him just how serious the threat was. He was not asking for a small amount of help. He was demanding a massive force. He asked Marshall to send him 2 aircraft carriers immediately. He also asked for 1,000 airplanes. This was a very large request. It showed just how desperate the situation in the South Pacific had become. MacArthur was the man on the spot. He could see the Japanese getting stronger every day. He knew that without a powerful fleet and a huge air force, Australia could not be held. The Japanese were building bases and airfields. They were getting ready to jump to the next island, and the next. MacArthur was sounding the alarm as loudly as he could. He needed the tools to fight back, and he needed them now. But in Washington, in that same month of May, Admiral Ernest J. King had his own terrible problems. As the chief of naval operations, he was the man who had to find those ships. He got MacArthur's urgent request from General Marshall, but he had to give him bad news. Admiral King informed General Marshall that until the end of June, he would have only 2 working aircraft carriers in the entire Pacific Ocean. Just 2. The American fleet was stretched terribly thin. The Japanese, on the eve of the Midway battle, had 10 carriers ready to fight. On top of this, the Pacific Fleet commander, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, had already given an advanced warning to Washington. His intelligence men at Pearl Harbor had broken parts of the Japanese naval code. They knew the Japanese were planning a very big move, a massive attack that turned out to be the Midway battle. With such a huge and dangerous fight about to happen, Admiral King could not possibly spare his precious carriers to send them to MacArthur in Australia. While these great events were taking their course, the Japanese did not stop their push into the south. Even as their big fleet sailed for Midway, their forces in the New Guinea and Solomon's area kept working. Major General Tamataro Hari landed his South Seas force at Salamoa and Laian, the coast of New Guinea. His troops immediately began to build up an air base there. This was all part of the original plan to capture Port Moresby. Working independently of Admiral Yamamoto's Midway plan, the Imperial General Staff in Tokyo had ordered this operation to continue. They told the local commander, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hayakutake, to press on toward New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, and they told him to be ready to resume the advance against Port Moresby by July. This would be right after the Midway battle, which they all expected to be a glorious Japanese victory. They believed Yamamoto's big carrier force would return and protect this new move south. The Japanese defeat at Midway was a great secret, but it was also a great victory for the Allies. However, Imperial General Headquarters did not alter its plans for the south. They told their forces in the field that Midway was a victory, so the advance continued. A few days after the battle, the Australians informed General MacArthur that the Japanese were getting ready to move again. Now that the American fleet had won at Midway, MacArthur suggested that the Allies should make a preemptive attack. He wanted to hit the main Japanese naval and air base at Rabaul. He again asked General Marshall for a huge force, this time with 3 carriers, 1 Marine division, and 3 Army divisions. But Admiral King in Washington opposed this idea. He did not like it at all. His main reason was that it would put General MacArthur, an Army man, in command of the fighting. King had his own plan. He wanted a drive from the New Hebrides, commanded by the Navy. The problem for the Joint Chiefs of Staff was who was going to command the operation. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had a big problem. They had 2 strong commanders, MacArthur and King, who both wanted to run the show. So they came up with a compromise. They split the operation into phases. Phase 1 would be the primary task. This was to take the Santa Cruz Islands, a small island of Tulagi, and other positions nearby. This phase was given to Admiral King and the Navy. It is interesting to see that in this first plan, the big island of Guadalcanal was just a spot on the map. It had no known tactical or strategic value. It did not even merit a name in the Joint Chiefs plan. General MacArthur was thrown a small piece of the action to keep him happy. After Phase 1 was finished, He was supposed to take over and mop up the Japanese in the rest of the Solomon Islands, at Rabaul, and in New Guinea. Admiral King was given his way in the beginning because the Joint Chiefs recognized that he had already planned a defense line down the Pacific to protect Australia. His plan, they believed, would need relatively less force than MacArthur's massive plan. Admiral King was already building up his forces in the South Pacific. Thousands of American troops were training in New Caledonia. King had also managed to wheedle General Arnold, the head of the Army Air Force, into sending several squadrons of planes there. He had reinforced the islands of Samoa and Efate in the New Hebrides. He also planned to put a new base on the island of Tonga. He was building a chain of strong points to stop the Japanese from moving any farther south. King was also making changes in command. He was not happy with Admiral Wilson Brown, who had been too indecisive during the Wake Island crisis. Brown was shipped off to a new unit in San Diego called the Amphibious Training Command. He and a Marine Major General, Holland Smith, were told to develop new techniques for fighting on islands. This was a brand new kind of warfare, and the Americans had to learn how to do it, and learn fast. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, who was King's chief plans officer, had a clear idea of what to do. He suggested that the first effort must be to hold the line in the South Pacific. While they were holding this line, they must train the new amphibious forces. The second stage would be a combined offensive. This attack would be made by the United States, Australia, and New Zealand fighting together. They would push up through the Solomon Islands, heading for the Bismarck Archipelago and the Admiralty Islands. The third stage would involve seizing the Japanese strongholds in the Caroline and Marshall Islands. The fourth and final stage would take the Allies either back to the Dutch East Indies or to the Philippines. Admiral King approved this plan. It was just what he himself envisioned. He made arrangements to bring Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, who was serving as an observer in London, back to the Pacific to head the new South Pacific Command. King then detached Rear Admiral Turner from the Plans Division and told him to get ready to take over as commander of the amphibious operation itself. All of this planning and moving of men was done, even before the Japanese made their big assault on Port Moresby and Tulagi. Vice Admiral Gormley left Washington on May 1st. He would take command of the South Pacific Force on June 19th. But first, he had to go to Pearl Harbor to report to Admiral Nimitz, who would be his direct superior. By the time Gormley got to Pearl Harbor, the Japanese offensive in the South Pacific was already beginning again. The intelligence reports started to come in. On May 22nd, an American Army plane was flying a patrol. It saw a Japanese photo reconnaissance aircraft taking pictures of Guadalcanal. This was a bad sign. Army intelligence looked at the report and suggested that the Japanese were preparing to build an airfield there. This was the first time this unknown island started to look important. The threat was no longer just a vague idea. It was becoming specific. On June 25th, the intelligence reports got more serious. An Army plane reported that the tall grass on the island's central plain had been burned off. This was a sure sign of construction. Tents had gone up in the area. A new wharf was being built at Lunga. The picture was becoming clearer. Just 6 days later, a brave Australian coast watcher who was hiding on Guadalcanal sent a radio message. He reported that the construction of an airfield was definite. The Japanese were only awaiting the arrival of their special construction units. This coast watcher was very good. He even knew the names of the units that were coming. He said they were the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces. These were the Japanese equivalent of the American CB units, the men who built things. This vital information was then confirmed. It was confirmed by a radio interception made by Admiral Nimitz's brilliant intelligence officers at Pearl Harbor. They had broken the code. The Pacific Fleet's radio intelligence group picked up a Japanese message. It said that the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces would arrive at their destination on July 4th, Fleet intelligence put two and two together. The destination had to be Guadalcanal. It just so happened that Admiral Turner was visiting Pearl Harbor on that very day. He was on his way to the South Pacific to prepare for an amphibious landing, but he did not know exactly where. When Admiral Nimitz received this new radio intelligence report, Admiral Turner's mission became crystal clear. He knew where he was going. It could be no place but the Solomons, and it had to be Guadalcanal. The Japanese could not be allowed to finish that airfield. Within 2 weeks, Turner was in Wellington, New Zealand. He boarded his flagship, the USS Macaulay. His task was enormous, and some said it was impossible. He had to train a whole amphibious task force in only 1 month. As Turner began to move his ships and men, Admiral Gormley, the new supreme commander for the area, was on his way to Melbourne. He had to confer with General MacArthur. Gormley left New Zealand with his head full of gloomy thoughts. He was a worried man. He thought this whole plan was foolishness. He believed they were trying to stage a big amphibious operation when no one even knew how to do it. When Admiral Gormley met General MacArthur, he found a man who agreed with him completely. MacArthur had his own reasons for disliking the plan. He still wanted to be in charge of the whole thing himself. The two of them agreed that with the small number of planes they had on hand, they could not guarantee the landing sufficient air coverage. This was a very serious problem. After all, this meeting was happening on July 18th. The landings were scheduled to be made in just 3 weeks. It was a terribly fast timetable. The two commanders sent a dispatch back to Washington. In it, they strongly recommended that the operation be deferred, that it be postponed. But in Washington, Admiral King was not happy with that message. King had already told his new commander, Gormley, that he was handing him a difficult job. He had warned him that he would not be able to give him the proper tools, perhaps until the fall. The answer from King was a very firm no. The invasion would proceed as planned. Gormley had left Washington already convinced that the United States was not ready for aggressive action in the South Pacific. His gloom only increased when he tried, and failed, to get the construction units and other men he needed sent immediately to New Zealand. From the very beginning, the plan to invade Guadalcanal was notable for its failures of intelligence. All the commands involved knew that an operation was in the offing. This was especially true after July 10th, when Admiral Nimitz sent Admiral Gormley his official operations orders. The planners knew the major Japanese airbase was located at Rabaul. This was the great fortress. They knew that planes from those fields could fly to Guadalcanal, refuel at the new airfield, and then easily bomb Australia. There was no doubt that this new airfield, if it was finished, would allow the Japanese to strike a deadly blow at the Allied buildup in the south. It had to be stopped. But on that same day, July 10th, the Allied intelligence report that reached Admiral King in Washington contained only a casual comment about airfield construction at Guadalcanal. A few days later, another report came in that located the new field on the wrong side of the island. By the end of July, the Japanese had, in fact, completed the airfield. And back at his headquarters in Japan, Admiral Yamamoto gave orders that the first staged mission from Rabaul would use that field on August 14th. The Americans were in a race against time, and they did not even know how close it was. As commander of the overall United States operation, Admiral Gormley tried desperately to get more help. He needed to build advanced bases and bring in more planes. But everywhere he turned, he learned the hard truth of Admiral King's assertion. King had been right. He would not be able to provide Gormley with the proper tools for the job. The supplies for the invasion forces were a perfect example of the problem. They were loaded all jumbled together, a complete hodgepodge, aboard the transports back at Oakland. There were plenty of docks in California. The ships could have been unloaded and then reloaded properly. They should have been loaded with the supplies in the correct order of their intended use, but they were not. Instead, The ships were sent to Noumea, which had no such facilities to fix the problem. Admiral King had at least a general idea of these difficulties, but there was simply no time for delay. King knew better than any of his subordinates the absolute, vital necessity of stopping the Japanese before they got to Australia. The timetable remained. By late July, the rush was on. 17,000 Marines were moving by troopship from California, from Pearl Harbor, from Noumea, and from Samoa. They were all converging on one small, unknown spot in the ocean. Admiral Gormley was so busy trying to manage this chaos that he could not even hold a conference of his commanders. Finally, on July 28th, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, the man who was supposed to be in tactical command of the whole operation, called a meeting. The commanders met aboard his flagship, the carrier Saratoga. This was the first time the tactical unit commanders, the men who would actually have to fight the battle, met to talk about the invasion plan. Admiral Fletcher was there to protect the invasion with his task force of aircraft carriers. Admiral Turner was there. His job was to deliver the troops. And Marine General Alexander Vandegrift was there. His men would have to take the island. The plan was simple. The Marines would take the island, and then garrison troops would be brought in to hold it. But this plan was so hastily called, so rushed, that no one had made provision for any troops to be held in reserve. There were no more men available in the entire South Pacific. This was the force. It would either win or be destroyed. There was no backup. The meeting on the Saratoga was not a happy one. It started badly and got worse. Admiral Fletcher began the meeting by announcing that he would protect the landings at Guadalcanal for only 2 days. This news was a bombshell. Admiral Turner was furious. He knew it would take at least 4 days, maybe more, to unload all the transports. Fletcher insisted that his carriers must not be risked. Gormley's staff members who were at the meeting agreed with him. Fletcher was gun-shy. He had been through the terrible Battle of the Coral Sea, where his carrier, the Lexington, had been sunk under him. He was terrified of losing another one to Japanese land-based planes. General Vandegrift, the Marine commander, sat and listened to the admirals argue. He was a tough, old-school Marine, and he was disgusted. He thought the whole operation was cockeyed, hasty, and doomed to fail. He felt like he was leading his men into a trap with no support. Admiral Turner, who had a much better idea of the global military picture than any other man in that cabin, finally spoke up. He chided his superior, Admiral Fletcher. He told him there was no point in that sort of argument. The decision had been made in Washington. It had been made at the highest level. The plan was to risk all. It was their job, as military men, to carry out their orders, not to question them. Fletcher ought to have known all that. After the Coral Sea battle, Admiral King had been so displeased with Fletcher's constant avoidance of action that he had insisted Admiral Nimitz find out the condition of Fletcher's fighting spirit. Nimitz was a kindly man, and he liked Fletcher. He had given the carrier commander a pep talk. Then, when the Battle of Midway was won, and Fletcher was in command, he could hardly be faulted. But now, on the eve of the first great American offensive of the war, to warn the troops and the support ships that he was going to desert them in 48 hours was a most inauspicious beginning. The rehearsal for the invasion, staged on July 28th, was a complete bust. Only a third of the troops managed to get ashore, and when they did not know what to do. General Vandegrift regarded the whole thing as a failure, but there was no time even to second guess. On July 31st, the Marines were back aboard their transports, heading for Guadalcanal.